Good evening, everyone. My name is Roy Culpepper. I'm the chair of the Group of 78. And welcome to this annual policy conference on global markets, inequality, and the future of democracy. The very first thing I would like to do is to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting here on land which is the traditional, unceded, and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. This acknowledgement surely is important at a conference such as ours, looking at inequality, given the stark political, economic, and social inequalities faced by Indigenous people in this country and in other countries for that matter. The G78 is a civil society organization that advocates progressive foreign policy promoting peace and nuclear disarmament, economic justice, and planetary survival. It originated in discussions led by Andrew Bruin and Murray Thompson, among others, in 1980. They produced a declaration signed by 78 eminent Canadians and sent to Prime Minister Trudeau, Pierre Trudeau. Had better luck with that one. You can get the complete story on the Group of 78 in your pack, which gives you the story of the Group of 78 going back to these early times. But I must mention here with deep regret that one of the prime movers of the G78, Murray Thompson, died in May this year at the age of 96. I was just at a memorial earlier today to mark his passing and the fantastic legacy he's given to the peace community, to the NGO development community, and to the environment community. We're eager to recruit new members and even board members, so please, if you're interested in the work and the activities of the G78, do sign up for a membership if you are not already a member. Last year's conference was on the climate crisis, and as you will have all observed, today was a historic day of mass demonstrations and protests all over the world, in Ottawa no less than in other cities. And there are a number of deep connections between the climate crisis and the economic crisis, which is what we're going to talk about today. So I'm looking to our speakers to try and make those connections in the course of their remarks. This conference comes on the heels of a decade or more of studies pointing to the interrelationship between global markets, widening inequality, and the erosion of democracy. Our speakers have all made important contributions to this work. But our aim at this conference is to move to the next stage. What is to be done about globalization, inequality, and the threat to democracy? The question has immediate pertinence in both Canada and the United States, given upcoming elections just a couple of weeks away, in the case of Canada, and a year away in a few months in the case of the US. Do these elections cast a shadow or open an opportunity for change? That is a question that we should address. And for everyone, what can and should be done to tame globalization, to reduce inequality, and to make democracy stronger? So I'd like to thank some people and organizations at the outset for their invaluable contribution to bring us all together tonight. First of all, Manfred Bienefeld as conference chair and conference committee chairman. Manfred. Second, Gordon Betcherman and the University of Ottawa for the room and facilities and Gordon's own personal input into the planning of the conference. Gordon Betcherman. Organizations that have generously provided funding: the Broadbent Institute, the Canadian Labour Congress, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, the National Union of Provincial and Government Employees, Carleton University, come on, and the University of Ottawa. And perhaps last but not least, maybe most of all, Sarah Bowles, our logistics coordinator and executive secretary to the Group of 78. Sarah's not in the room right now. Okay, so it's now my pleasure to introduce someone who will actually in turn introduce our keynote speaker. And I'm talking here about Ed Broadbent. Now, many of you will say Ed needs no introduction, but that's not going to stop me. Ed was, of course, leader of the NDP from 1975 to 1989. And famously, he ended his term by sponsoring an all-party resolution to eradicate child poverty in Canada in 1989, a benchmark which is still revisited and unfortunately found wanting on the part of the Canadian government. Ed came back as a member for Ottawa Centre in the 2004 to 2006 Parliament before finally stepping down his activity as a politician. He was president of the International Centre for Human Rights and Democratic Development from 1990 to 1996. And in 2011, he helped establish and has chaired the Broadbent Institute, oddly enough, one of our sponsors for tonight. But I'd like to say this. Besides his active experience in politics, Ed brings intellectual heft and scholarship to our conference. As a PhD student at the University of Toronto, he was supervised by C.B. Macpherson, perhaps Canada's most famous political philosopher. I should also note that in this regard that Macpherson's writings going back to the 1960s on possessive individualism, liberal democracy, and equality resonate with the themes of our conference tonight. And clearly, Macpherson has had a lifelong impact on Ed and others. I was also a student of Macpherson's as an undergraduate. After he retired as NDP leader, Ed demonstrated his scholarly interest in these issues, for example, in his book, Democratic Equality, What Went Wrong. So I'd like to call upon Ed to give us some of his thoughts on this conference and its leading questions, as well as to introduce our keynote speaker. Please welcome Ed Broadbent.
Thank you very much, Roy. I want to just make one brief comment before I get into my pleasurable task of making a few comments on the conference, as well as to introduce our distinguished guest. And that is, I heard the name Murray Thomson mentioned, and I want to say in my long political life, stretching back many decades, there is no finer Canadian that I've encountered than Murray Thomson. It is indeed my pleasure to make some introductory comments on the conference, and in particular to introduce Robert Kuttner, a distinguished academic and journalist who is one of the United States' leading public intellectuals. In American terms, he's a small L liberal, very much rooted in the New Deal democratic tradition. In Canadian terms, he would be regarded as a strong, principled social democrat, and he has consistently been such over a very long career. He published a long article in The Atlantic in 1983, The Declining Middle, which presently warned of rising inequality in the United States at the start of the Reagan era and the resulting threat to democratic institutions and values. In 1984, he wrote a major book, The Economic Illusion, which attacked the false idea of the right that we have to choose between prosperity on the one hand and greater equality and social justice on the other. Then last year he published a very important new book, Can Democracy Survive Global Capitalism?, which speaks very directly to the aims and purposes of this important conference. In his discussion of the signs of failure of current democratic societies, I want to emphasize how persistently Professor Kuttner gives as examples of failure, whether in the US, Britain, or Germany, the economic impacts of globalization on the many or the poor are what counts. In this, I note a significant departure from today's mainstream political scientists worldwide who see democracy virtually exclusively in terms of political and civil rights. In departing from this, he joins a much older democratic tradition dating from the Athenian democracy. This tradition, stretching from Plato and Aristotle, who opposed democracy, to John Stuart Mill, who reluctantly at times, but ultimately favored it, saw democracy as a system of government that favored the many and the poor. That is to say, those who opposed it, like Plato and Aristotle, and those who supported it, like Mill, up to that period in history, saw democracy as being really defined in terms of its impact as a political system on the many and the poor. This view of democracy is best intimated in Abraham Lincoln's pithy, quote, government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I would argue that in many ways, it was the strong action of classical social democracy that retrieved this democratic tradition in the mid-20th century in Europe and Canada. They did this by their implementation of social and economic rights on top of existing liberal democratic freedoms, by decommodifying health services, pensions, the right of unions, and other social services. They showed that with political will, in these aspects of life, the power of the market could be and should be broken if real democracy is to be achieved. In the US, Franklin Roosevelt should be added to the social democratic list of Willy Brandt in West Germany, Olof Palme in Sweden, Bruno Kreisky in Austria, and Tommy Douglas here in Canada. In his last address to Congress, Roosevelt explicitly said that the American Bill of Rights was insufficient if democracy is to be achieved. He was and remains the only US president to say this. An economic Bill of Rights, he stressed, needed to be added. His proposed bill included a list of social and economic rights that came to characterize social democracy in the mid-20th century in other countries. His proposed bill, of course, was ignored by a post-war Republican Congress and was not brought forward by any subsequent president. I note with pleasure that currently such rights are to be found in the political agendas of both Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. I, and no doubt most of you, will share Robert Kuttner's central concern that globalization in its current form has come to pose a major threat to democracy. Rising inequality and stagnant living standards for working people, combined with the weakening of the labor movement as an economic and political force, have fed the rise of the anti-democratic populist right. The key alternative is to build a renewed left that embraces markets, but is prepared to closely regulate them in the public interest so as to build a much more equal democratic society. I strongly agree with one key theme and argument of Professor Kuttner's, namely that the rise of inequality and insecurity following the dismantling of the New Deal bargain in the United States and elsewhere was essentially a political choice, not the inevitable product of globalization and technological change. To the contrary, corporate and political elites actively pursued a particular form of globalization which led to the destruction of thousands of jobs, the decline of unions as an economic and political force, and increased the economic and political power of corporate elites. The loss of social and economic benefits for working class Americans, while the rich became even richer, has led to the right-wing populism of Donald Trump, which threatens political and civil rights. I also agree with Professor Kuttner that the center-left was, to an uncomfortable degree for me, complicit in this shift to the right. In the United States, many Democrats, notably Bill Clinton, embraced the so-called free market agenda and alienated their traditional working class base, which then shifted to the right. This was also true of Blair in Britain and Schroeder in Germany, who undermined unions and labor rights and embraced the dominance of markets. As Margaret Thatcher once boasted, her major accomplishment was the conversion of Tony Blair to the view that there is, quote, no alternative to neoliberal policies. I want briefly to register the fact that the political trajectory here in Canada has been somewhat different from that of the United States. The shift to social democracy in Canada came more in the 1960s and 1970s than in the immediate post-war period, and unions and social democracy in the form of the NDP remain much stronger than in the United States. The key shift to the right in Canada at the federal level came in the mid-1990s, when the Liberals attacked labor and the welfare state in the name of deficit reduction, ignoring viable alternative policies. The Chrétien government's 1995 budget was the biggest cut in social spending since World War II. While I'm very much aware of the political threat of right-wing populism, many, perhaps most, Canadians, I believe, still adhere to social democratic values and are open to a form of left-wing populism, a populism that embraces civil liberties but attacks forcefully our deep inequality. In his new book, Professor Kuttner persuasively argues that there is no global government and that democracy must necessarily be defended and restored primarily at the national level. But as he notes, most international institutions, such as the IMF, and including the European Union, have generally pursued pro-market rather than egalitarian and democratic goals. He and one-time globalist Danny Roderick and Joseph Stiglitz argue that when there is a clash with domestic political traditions in a conflict with international trade rules, local preferences should prevail. As part of a new progressive agenda, Professor Kuttner stresses the need to give governments this greater control over their national economic policies. He also notes that coordinated progressive action will be needed to shut down the tax havens and the reform of global financial system. I would add that we also absolutely need coordinated global action to deal with catastrophic climate change and to promote democratic and trade union rights in all countries. I believe that Bob Kuttner is right. The constraints of globalization on domestic progressive policies tend to be exaggerated, and that political will can make a huge difference. That said, the issue is more challenging for a small country like Canada than a major economic power such as the United States. This will no doubt be reflected in our discussions over the next couple of days. I very much look forward to hearing what Professor Kuttner has to say, and I'm delighted that he will be able to stay with us to discuss the hugely important issues which he has already raised. I welcome Professor Kuttner.